President.
The Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I want to begin by thanking our colleagues, particularly from Oklahoma and Alabama, for leading the working group that was appointed by the majority leader to try to solve this problem. In their typical deliberative and careful and thoughtful fashion, they could have come up with a lot of ideas that would, I think, perhaps overreach. But rather than do that, they've come up with a solution that Democrats themselves have proposed, which to me strikes me as the epitome of fairness. But there are three main points I want to make before I sort of summarize where I think we are. First of all, as my colleagues have eloquently noted, we have exhausted virtually every other alternative to this vote to overrule the parliamentarian and establish a new precedent, which is an alternative to a formal rule change which takes 67 votes. But we know our colleagues will never vote for that, leaving us no alternative but to invoke what is sometimes called the nuclear option. But as our colleague from Missouri just pointed out, this is really not so much a nuclear option as a restoration option. This is restoring the Senate to the way it used to work, not just before President Trump was reelected, but for the last couple hundred years, where we had an orderly process to consider a president's nominees, a committee process to vet them, and then a debate and a vote on the Senate floor, so that the mandate of the voters in the presidential election can be carried out by the president. So we've tried virtually everything else, but I'm going to give them one last chance here in a minute. But then as I've been thinking about it, what have we been doing while we've spent hour upon hour, day upon day, week upon week, trying to move through all these various Senate-confirmed nominees with no help, not just no help, but with active obstruction by our Democratic colleagues? I think about all the other things that we could be working on, even together, bipartisan solutions to our nation's biggest problems and challenges. Economists call that opportunity cost. In other words, when you're mired down in this mindless obstruction and blocking any nominee just because they happen to be nominated by President Trump, you're missing the opportunity to do other important things. And I know all of my colleagues, all 100 of us, came here to hopefully do important things. And that has been the source of great consternation and disappointment, I know, to many of us. But then I think about the people who have been nominated by President Trump. I've had them tell me this is an honor of a lifetime. People who've enjoyed tremendous success in business or in their professional life, to then give all that up in order to serve their country. These are patriots. And it is profoundly unfair to them, to their families, and to the American people to continue to block these nominees and leave them basically hanging in the wind. I've talked to many of them myself, these nominees, asking, Senator, when can I expect a vote on the Senate floor? I said, well, I don't know. Many of them have said, well, I've had to quit my job or sell my business. I've had to go through a rigorous vetting process for ethics and legal conflicts of interest. And I'm waiting. And my family is waiting, not knowing whether we will be going to maybe an embassy somewhere around the world or serve in some other important position here in Washington, D.C. in the Trump administration. So this is profoundly unfair to them. And we wonder whether we are having a hard time getting good people to want to serve in government. Well, thankfully, there are still people who are willing to do it despite the way they get treated when they are nominated. Thank goodness there's still good people who want to serve. Our nation depends on it. But just to summarize, more than 140 of President Trump's nominees are waiting to be voted on as we speak. I don't know how you argue the converse of what I feel to be the case, which is the president won the election on November the 5th, and he's entitled to his team. He's at least entitled to an up or down vote on the nominations. And the American people are the ones who actually gave him that mandate. And this is a kick in the teeth, a punch in the gut to those voters who voted for President Trump in this last election, expecting that he would bring change to Washington, D.C. But he can't accomplish that mandate without his team. As we've heard, Senate Democrats are now engaged in an unprecedented level of obstruction, preventing these nominees from being confirmed, burning up all the floor time when we're in session on waiting around to vote on these nominees, most of whom in the past would have been confirmed by a voice vote or some sort of expedited process, by consent even. But not with Donald J. Trump as president. Democrats have taken a completely different approach and obstructing each and every one of his nominees. Most of these individuals are uncontroversial. I remember the other day we were voting on General Counsel for Advocacy for the Small Business Administration. And I asked myself, what is that? And yes, maybe, just maybe, we should limit the number of Senate-confirmed positions. I think that might be a good exercise to go through and see, are there people who currently require Senate confirmation that it really isn't necessary because they only serve for a short period of time under the leadership of maybe a cabinet-confirmed, a member of the president's cabinet that is Senate-confirmed. But under President George Herbert Walker Bush and President Clinton, 98% of those nominees were confirmed by unanimous consent. Under George W. Bush and President Obama, 90% were confirmed by unanimous consent. That's no debate, no argument, just a unanimous consent request without objection, so ordered. During President Trump's first term in office, only 65% were, so you can see the slide from 98 to 90 to 65, and what we've also learned is what goes around comes around. President Biden, his number was 57%. But that's a far cry from what we've seen in President Trump's second term, with zero of these non-controversial nominees, patriots who want nothing but to serve their country, being denied that opportunity out of blind partisan obstruction, mindless obstruction. And the only way it can be explained, the senator from Missouri mentioned Trump derangement syndrome, and this is it in all of its ugly manifestation. There's no other explanation. Now, changing the Senate rules is not something we do lightly, because we know what comes around, but the truth is, Republicans are more than willing to live with the change in the rules when Democrats are in the majority, when there's a Democrat president, which someday there may well be. So we are acting on behalf of all senators, of all presidents, of all nominees, and the entire American people when we say something has to change, and we are going to change it this week. I know all of us would prefer to deal with this in some way other than overruling the parliamentarian and invoking the so-called nuclear option, but we've exhausted all of the other possibilities. With one exception, perhaps. In a moment, I'm going to propose a unanimous consent request on a resolution that would allow the majority leader to call up at least 10 nominees advanced out of the same committee to be considered for a vote in block or altogether. This is something very similar to that which the chairman of the Rules Committee, Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota, and Angus King, an independent from Maine, had proposed in 2023. And if Democrats were really interested in solving the problem, if they were really interested in restoring the Senate to its previous reputation as the world's greatest deliberative body, they wouldn't object, they would agree. It's their idea. But what remains to be seen is whether Senate Democrats will agree to their own proposal. If Senate Democrats will consent to this proposal, which I will propound momentarily, which will allow en bloc consideration of nominees, then we can avoid a rule change. But if they block this resolution, they will show their true colors. They will show that this is not about deliberation. This is not about what's in the best interest of the American people. This is not about genuine oversight. This is naked, partisan obstruction. It will then be clear to all of us across the country that Democrat objections to changing the rules have nothing to do with preserving the institutional integrity of the Senate, and more to do with their crusade against President Trump and the American people who elected him last November the 5th. We'll see if Senate Democrats would prefer to continue their historic obstruction or whether they would consent to let us carry out the essential function of this chamber to provide a vote. That's all we're asking for, is a vote on the nominations. Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Committee on Rules and Administration be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 379 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the resolution be agreed to and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Reserving the right to object. I've been listening to my colleague from Texas, and part of what he said a couple of times over the last several minutes was looking for some sort of explanation as to why Democrats are doing what we're doing. So let me attempt to respond to that. Can't help but observe that my colleague from Texas and Senate Republicans like to point out that Senate Democrats were proposing reforms to the nominations process in 2024. Yes, just last year. That's not a secret. A formal proposal was introduced. The Senate Rules Committee, of which I was a member and am now serving as ranking member this session, held a public hearing on these issues just over a year ago. There have been bipartisan discussions about these issues going back years. Senate Democrats led a bipartisan effort in 2024 for changes that would take effect in 2025. Now, why are those dates important? Because these proposals were made back when the outcome of last year's presidential election was unknown. Like, that's the ultimate fair way to do it. That's the way to get bipartisan support. These ideas are good or not good. You support them, you don't support, regardless of who's president, which party is in power. But unfortunately, Senate Republicans at the time showed little interest in these reforms, not just last summer, even late into 2024. Can't help but observe that at the time they were engaging in their own unprecedented obstruction and blockades of President Biden's nominees. One Republican senator, held up routine promotions at the Department of Defense for nearly a year. Yes, I said Department of Defense, by the way. And they were planning to use these same tactics if then Vice President Harris had been elected president. But now with Donald Trump back in the White House, surprise, surprise, they're ready and set to make all these changes immediately. The truth is, we shouldn't be in this situation. On that much, I guess we do agree. But I'm not just talking about the process. Not just talking about the process. Since the beginning of the second Trump administration, this Senate has been faced with an unprecedented number of highly extreme and unqualified, unfit nominees. Many nominees whose stated goal is to dismantle the departments and agencies and programs with which they're being nominated to lead. Meanwhile, this administration is unlawfully impounding funds, firing people in droves, and abolishing agencies created by Congress. Actions that, if this Senate and Congress as a whole was living up to its responsibility as a separate but co-equal branch of government, the branch that's supposed to be providing oversight, accountability, that's so lacking by the majority, yet still, given all that, Senate Democrats have been willing to negotiate. We've been partners in good faith. There was even a bipartisan agreement on the table just before the August recess that we just returned from, a proposal that would expedite some of the less objectionable nominees. All the administration had to do was accommodate some reasonable requests, bipartisan requests, for that matter, from a number of senators. Now, that's the normal process. Presidents and administrations of both parties have cooperated with senators from both parties for decades to ensure confirmation of nominees. But Trump rejected that option just weeks ago. The president himself told Leader Schumer and Senate Democrats to, quote, go to hell before the recess. Those three words are the perfect summary of how this president views Congress. It shows his contempt for Congress. And that's why we're in this situation when it comes to his nominees. Many, again, of whom are extreme and unfit in so many unprecedented ways. Talk about unprecedented. The way this administration is behaving is unprecedented. This is not normal. Now, it's clear that the president rejected a reasonable bipartisan agreement before the recess, and I appreciate my Republican colleagues' new interest in the 2024 proposal to reform the nomination process. So in that spirit of bipartisan cooperation, I think this is a very good chance that we can pass this with a very simple amendment to make the resolution effective January 20th, 2029. Nobody here knows who the president will be then. Nobody knows which party will control the White House or be in the majority in this body by then. Nobody can predict that, and that's exactly the point. If the rule is good, then let's do it not knowing who is going to be in power when it takes effect. So I invite discussion, negotiation about the effective date in this resolution, or, as my colleague from Texas suggested, maybe even revisiting the list of which nominees should require Senate confirmation. But this resolution doesn't even begin to discuss or address that. So as this resolution is currently drafted, it is unacceptable, and therefore I object.
Mr. President.
The objection is heard. The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, of course, I'm disappointed that our colleagues from California objecting on behalf of the Democrats in the chamber. But I just want to summarize what I think I heard him say. First, Democrats are prepared to hold all these nominees hostage pending some sort of agreement. Well, you heard from the senator from Alabama, the senator from Missouri, the senator from Oklahoma, all talk about the endless discussions with individual members of the Senate Democrats, many of whom are sympathetic to the problem, but were powerless to change it. Because the leadership, the minority leader, the senator from New York, who controls that caucus, would not hear of any sort of negotiation. We're all accustomed to negotiating around here. We do it on a daily basis. But we have tried in good faith every possible permutation short of this action that we are taking today. But I have to ask, is it in good faith to say, let's wait until 2029 to change the rules? What's President Trump supposed to do over the next 3 years? Govern with one arm tied behind his back without the team he was elected, that he has selected to help him govern the country? He won the election on last November the 5th. He got a mandate. People are sick and tired of the status quo here in Washington, D.C. They want to see change. They want to see things shaken up. But now Democrats are saying you've got to wait until 2029. That's obviously unacceptable. And then finally, I would just point out, we could have offered a number of different solutions to this problem, some that perhaps would advantage Republicans and disadvantage Democrats. But we haven't done that. We said, let's take a Democratic proposal from 2023 and offer that. Surely they think that's reasonable since they themselves have proposed it in the first instance. But what we've just heard is that Democrats won't even agree to that. Their own proposal, their own idea. So to me, it's abundantly clear that we've exhausted all the opportunities for negotiation. We've vetted a number of different alternatives, but it is this all-consuming, mindless, partisan objection to President Trump and his policies that are blinding our Democratic colleagues from doing what they know is right, which is to having a way with debate and with votes to give the American people a president who has a team to carry through the policies that they voted for on November the 5th. So, Mr. President, I am disappointed but not surprised. But I think we've done everything we can. This obstruction has to end, and it will end very soon.